Imagine you're at a heavy metal concert. The lights go dim, the crowd surges forward, the drummer lifts his sticks high, and then smash! The most guttural, earth-shaking sound you've ever heard erupts from the amplifiers. It's not singing, it's not screaming, it's something else entirely. It's the sound of humans pushing their vocal cords to the absolute limit of what is biologically possible. Welcome to death metal. If you've never heard of death metal, you might be thinking of something violent or disturbing, and honestly, you'd be partially right. But here's what most people don't know. Death metal is one of the most technically impressive, musically complex, and philosophically rich genres in all of heavy metal. It's a genre that celebrates precision, mathematical timing, and an almost academic dedication to sonic extremity. Today we're going to answer the question, what is death metal? We'll explore its origins in the late 1980s, dissect its defining musical characteristics, break down those infamous guttural vocals, and examine the genre's surprisingly intellectual lyrical themes, and meet some of the pioneers who helped create this uncompromising sound. By the end of this video, you'll have a whole new appreciation for the music that sounds like a garbage disposal heating cement mixer. Let's dive in. Defining death metal. So what exactly is death metal? Let's start with the basics. Death metal is a subgenre of heavy metal that emerged in the mid to late 1980s. It's characterized by its heavily distorted guitars, aggressive drumming, and super low-tuned instruments, and perhaps most distinctively, death growls, those deep guttural voices that sound like someone singing from the depths of Freddy Krueger's nightmares. Death metal isn't just about being loud or heavy. There's actually a method to the madness. The genre places an enormous emphasis on technical proficiency. We're talking about musicians who often have classical training, jazz influences, and an obsessive attention to rhythm and timing. If standard rock and roll is a wild sprint through a meadow, death metal is a perfectly choreographed marathon through an obstacle course while on fire. The best death metal bands make extraordinary complex compositions feel somehow both chaotic and precisely engineered at the same time. Now let's address the elephant in the room, the vocals. How do musicians actually produce those sounds? There's no single technique. Some vocalists use what are called false chord vocalizations, or vocal fry, where they vibrate their false vocal cords. Those are the chords above your actual vocal cords, which allow them to create the impossible low rumbles. Others use a technique sometimes called pig squeals, which involves constricting the throat to produce higher-pitched metallic sounds that somehow still manage to sound inhuman. Something that surprises most people, many death metal vocalists can't actually sustain these sounds for very long. Recording sessions often involve taking multiple breaks, drinking lots of water, and sometimes literally gargling with ice to reduce inflammation. It's genuinely hard on the vocal cords, which is why many death metal singers transition to cleaner vocals as they age, or why some legends unfortunately had to quit touring due to vocal damage. The genre also has many subgenres worth knowing about. Melodic death metal incorporates more melodic guitar lines and sometimes clean vocals alongside the growls. Think of bands like In Flames or Dark Tranquillity from Sweden. Technical death metal pushes complexity even further with intricate time signatures, proggy arrangements, and almost mathematical precision. Bands like Obscura and Periphery represent this style. Brutal death metal focuses on the sheer heaviness and intensity, often with faster tempos and even more extreme sounds. Florida's Cannibal Corpse is perhaps the most famous example. Death doom slows things down, taking the aggression of death metal and combining it with the pessimistic atmosphere of doom metal. It's like funeral music for the end of the world itself. Each subgenre offers a different flavor, but they all share that core foundation: heavy instrumentation, technical musicianship, and those unforgettable vocals. Just before we continue our journey into death metal, if you're finding this exploration worthwhile, hit that subscribe button and join the What Is community. We explore all kinds of fascinating topics, and I think you'll like what comes next. Alright, now that we know what death metal is, let's explore where it came from. History and origins. To understand death metal, we need to get in our DeLoreans and travel back to the mid-1980s, a time when heavy metal was evolving rapidly and pushing boundaries in every direction. The roots of death metal can be traced directly to thrash metal, the faster, angrier cousin of classic heavy metal that gave us bands like Slayer, Megadeth, and Metallica. Thrash had already proven that metal could be aggressive, intense, and politically charged, but some musicians wanted to go even further. The earliest death metal bands began experimenting with slower, heavier songs featuring deeper vocals and more disturbing themes. These were inspired by horror movies, from the gory practical effects of the 80s slasher films to the cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft, and wanted to translate that visceral, unsettling energy into music. Two scenes emerged as the birthplace of death metal: Florida and Sweden. In Florida, a movement sometimes called Florida death metal, or gore grind, was brewing in cities like Tampa and Orlando. Bands like Death, Obituary, and Morbid Angel became pioneers. And here's where it gets historically significant. Death, led by guitarist and visionary Chuck Schuldiner, released Scream Bloody Gore in 1987, and many music historians consider this the first true death metal album. It had everything: extremely fast drums, heavily distorted guitars, bludgeoning riffs, and growls that sounded like they came from beyond the grave. The genre was born. Chuck Schuldiner wasn't just a musician, he was essentially the genre's founding father. He wrote, recorded, and produced much of Death's early material, and later evolved the band's sound across albums that progressively showcase more technical skill and musical ambition. If you want to understand death metal's DNA, you start with Chuck. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in Sweden, a parallel but distinct scene was developing: Swedish death metal, that would later be known as Swedish melodic death metal or Gothenburg sound, which brought a slightly different approach. While Florida death metal tended towards pure brutality, the Swedish bands incorporated melodic guitar hooks, atmospheric arrangements, and occasionally cleaner singing. The city of Gothenburg became synonymous with this style, with bands like In Flames, Dark Tranquillity, and At the Gates leading the charge in the early to mid-1990s. These bands didn't just create music, they built an entire aesthetic. The distinctive Swedish corpse paint, white face paint with dark circles around the eyes, became instantly recognizable and influenced generations of metal musicians worldwide. By the early 1990s, death metal had developed its own infrastructure: specialized record labels like Nuclear Blast and Relapse Records, dedicated metal magazines like Metal Hammer and Kerrang, and a passionate underground fan base that traded cassette tapes and corresponded through actual handwritten letters. Yes, kids, this was before the internet, and somehow we survived. The genre never achieved mainstream commercial success in the traditional sense. That's just not what death metal is about. But it had developed a fiercely loyal following and influenced countless musicians across virtually every genre of heavy music. Modern metalcore, progressive metal, gent, and even some alternative rock bands have adopted techniques and philosophies directly from death metal. And here's something that might surprise you. Death metal's influences extend far beyond heavy music. Classical composers, film score composers, and experimental musicians have studied death metal techniques for their rhythmic complexity and emotional intensity. Some symphony orchestras have performed arrangements of death metal songs, not because they're secretly metalheads, but because the compositions themselves are genuinely interesting from a musical theory standpoint. That's the legacy of death metal. It took the aggression of heavy metal and transformed it into something genuinely artistic and intellectually demanding. Themes and ideology. Now let's talk about what death metal is actually about. If you only knew about death metal from media coverage or cautious parents warning you about devil music, you probably assume it's all about violence, Satan, and negativity. And while some bands definitely explore those themes, the reality is far more nuanced, and honestly way more interesting. Early death metal lyrics drew heavily on horror movie imagery: gore, zombies, mutilation, cosmic horror. Bands like Cannibal Corpse built entire careers around lyrics so disturbingly graphic that some stores actually refused to stock their albums. But here's the important context. This was largely an artistic statement about pushing boundaries and challenging social taboos. It was metal's version of shock art, an intentional provocation designed to make people uncomfortable and spark conversations about why certain things disturb us. As the genre matured, so did its lyrical content. Many death metal bands began exploring genuinely thought-provoking themes. Philosophy and existentialism. Questions about morality, the meaning of existence, and humanity's place in the universe. Some death metal lyricists drew heavily from existential philosophy, exploring through the lens of horror fiction. Science fiction. Concepts like artificial intelligence, space exploration, dystopian futures, and the potential, both hopeful and terrifying, of human technological advancement. Social commentary. Critics have pointed out that bands like Cattle Decapitation satirize human civilization's treatment of animals and the environment, delivering genuinely provocative messages wrapped in extreme musical packaging. Personal and psychological themes. Depression, inner turmoil, and the human condition. Surprisingly, death metal often provides an emotional outlet for listeners dealing with difficult feelings. The aggressive music becomes a cathartic release. Here's something that may reshape how you think about the genre. Many death metal fans describe the music as emotionally uplifting, not despite of its heaviness, but because of it. The intensity creates a space where overwhelming emotions can be processed safely. It's actually pretty similar to how some people use horror movies to confront fear in a controlled environment. There's also the philosophical thread running throughout death metal culture that's often overlooked. Many death metal musicians describe themselves as agnostic or atheist, and their dark themes aren't really about promoting evil. They're about questioning organized religion, exploring human morality without comforting illusions, and embracing the reality that life is temporary and often brutal. Far from being nihilistic, many death metal fans and artists are actually deeply thoughtful people who use extreme art to process complex emotions about existence. The aggressive exterior often hides a genuinely philosophical depth. Key artists and essential listening. Now let's get to the part you've probably been waiting for, the music. Here are essential death metal artists every newcomer should know. Death. As mentioned, Chuck Schuldina's band, essentially the genre's namesake, start with Symbolic 1995 for more accessible melodic death metal, or Spiritual Healing 1990 for classic Florida death metal. Cannibal Corpse, the most notorious band in death metal. Their early albums are notoriously graphic, but their musicianship is undeniable. Start with Tomb of the Mutilated 1992, or the slightly more restrained Bloodthirst 2002. Obituary, pioneers of Florida death metal with a slightly more straightforward, mosh-friendly approach. Self-titled and Cause of Death are essential listening. Chuck Schuldina's Control Reservoir, underrated project showing Schuldina's more experimental side with genuine progressive rock elements. In Flames, the definitive Swedish melodic death metal band. Their 1990s catalogue, especially the Jester Race 1996, is absolutely essential. At the Gates, another Swedish pioneer whose 1995 album Slaughter of the Soul profoundly influenced modern metalcore. Nile, for something truly unique. Egyptian-themed death metal with Middle Eastern scales and incredibly technical arrangements. Amongst the Catacombs of Nefren-Ka is a masterpiece. Opeth, a Swedish band that evolved from pure death metal into progressive excellence. Their earlier work, particularly Blackwater Park, blends death metal fury with acoustic passages and genuine beauty. Ludwig, newer wave technical death metal, pushing the genre's complexity even further with jazz-infused arrangements. For a quick sampling, I'd recommend checking out these landmarks. For melodic death metal mastery, Zero Tolerance by Bellacore. For technical innovation, Pulling Out Nails by Cynic. Thrash metal infused death metal, there's Mouth of Madness by Annihilator. Environmental themes and French precision comes from Life Unled by Gojira. And for a modern classic, The Last Silencer, October 21. What was the first death metal song that you heard that got you into the genre? Drop it in the comments below. For me, it was Skull Full of Maggots by Cannibal Corpse. Cultural impact and misconceptions. Before we wrap up, let's address some of the common misconceptions about death metal. Misconception 1. Death metal fans are angry or violent people. Actually, studies consistently show that metal fans, death metal included, are no more prone to violence than any other music fans. Many describe the music as therapeutic, a way to process difficult emotions in a healthy outlet. Misconception 2. Death metal promotes Satanism. While some bands explore dark themes, the vast majority aren't actually Satanists. Many are atheists exploring horror as art, or agnostics questioning religious orthodoxy. Misconception 3. It takes no talent. This one particularly annoys me. Death metal requires extraordinary technical skill. The intricate rhythms, precise timing, and sustained intensity demand years of practice. Plus, maintaining those vocals without damaging your throat is genuinely challenging. Misconception 4. Death metal fans are all teenage rebels. The demographics might surprise you. The average death metal fan is actually in their 30s or 40s, often professionals, academics, and thoughtful individuals who simply appreciate complex music. And there you have it. What death metal is, where it came from, and why it matters. Death metal represents one of heavy music's most technically demanding and artistically ambitious expressions. It transformed the aggression of early metal into something complex and thought-provoking, proving that extreme art can also be meaningful art. Whether you end up loving it or deciding it's not for you, I hope this video gave you a newfound appreciation for the musicians who've dedicated their lives to pushing their creative boundaries, even if those boundaries sound like a garbage disposal fighting a chainsaw. Remember to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more What Is. If you want to continue exploring music of every genre, check out our other musical What Is videos. There's a playlist linked above. Also, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Are you a death metal fan or a newcomer? What other music genres would you like me to cover next? Thanks for watching, stay curious, stay hungry, and see you next time.